Depression is the worst disease you can get. 15% people will have a major depression at some point. Who says depression is the number 4 cause of disability, and by 2025 it's going to be number 2, after obesity and diabetes-related disorders. Biology in depression. Reactive depression. When something awful happens and you feel terrible for a while, and then come out the other end. Major depression. Something awful happens, you're flattened by it for long periods afterward. And sometimes it doesn't take something awful to happen to produce it. It's a biochemical disorder, with a genetic component, and early experience influences. It's the inability to feel pleasure. Symptoms. Hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. Anhedonia. The inability to feel pleasure. Grief/guilt. Sometimes getting obsessive of something they did 12 years ago. Or even takes on a delusional quality, where they think everything that happens is inevitably getting worse, when it's not the case. Self-injury. Mutilating, risk of suicide. Psychomotor retardation. Everything is exhausting. And when they're starting to getting better, when they have the energy, it's when they try to do something catastrophic. Vegetative symptoms. The bodies of major depressives work differently, it's not just a matter of come on, pull yourself together, it's a biological disorder. 1. Problems with sleep. They wake up at 4 to 5 a.m., they're exhausted, but can't sleep. There are different stages of sleep. Slow wave sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, etc. Sort of 90-minute cycles as you go through the different phases. And if you see the brain of somebody with depression, these phases are completely disordered. 2. Appetite. When you feel unloved, carbohydrates make you feel better, because it decreases stress hormone release. But somebody with depression, it decreases his appetite. 3. Stress response. More activation of stress response. Overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline. It increases metabolic rate, muscle tone, etc. Also, they have rhythmic patterns to the depression. Somebody falls into depression, with 2 months of extreme severe symptoms, come out the other end. But 6 months later, the exact same pattern occurs. Then in the next 6 months, and so on. Or even only during winter, or summer, etc. Called seasonal affective disorders, SADS. And it's all about his biological clocks out of order. Chemistry of depression. How neurons talk to each other. 2 neurons. In order for one neuron to send a message to another one, it needs to release a chemical messenger that floats to the other neuron to do something. The chemical messenger is called neurotransmitter. There's a space between, called a synapse. Neuron excited, filled with neurotransmitters synapse release the neurotransmitters binds to a receptor equals changes the other neuron. Neurotransmitters involved in depression. Norepinephrine. In the 60s. The first antidepressant called MAO inhibitors. After the process of 2 neurons get excited, the neurotransmitter can recycle, or enzyme sitting next to the receptor degraded it. So, the MAO inhibitors inhibit the activity of the enzyme that breaks down norepinephrine. So, it's just floating around, that it hits the receptor a second time, third time, etc. time. And depression goes away. Too little norepinephrine equals depression. Another drug, tricyclic antidepressants. This one recycles the neurotransmitters. And depression goes away. Also, drugs that decrease norepinephrine release. Like reserpine, which is used on people with high blood pressure. And as side effect they get depressed. What does norepinephrine? It's related to anhedonia. Take a rat. And make him unbelievably happy. You stimulate with an electrode some areas of his brain, which mediates pure pleasure, called pleasure pathway. In the 60s, people stimulated the same area in the human brain. And they discovered, it uses epinephrine to get excited. Problems. If you use any of those drugs on somebody with depression, they don't get better for a couple of weeks. They found another neurotransmitter, which is more important, called dopamine. 1980s, Prozac, is an SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which works in a neurotransmitter called serotonin. If you give it to somebody with depression, they feel better. So now we know. Low dopamine equals anhedonia. Low norepinephrine equals psychomotor retardation. Low serotonin equals obsessive sense of grief/guilt. Also, in obsessive compulsive disorder, if you give them Prozac, it decreases their symptoms. Also, substance P. A neurotransmitter related to pain. And if you use a drug that decreases substance P signaling, sometimes depressives get better. Neuroanatomy on depression. The structure in the brain. In the 40s, the concept triune brain appears. Down at the bottom, you've got the nuts and bolts part of the brain, the reptilian part, which regulate boring things, measures your blood glucose levels, etc. In the middle, the limbic system. Only on mammals. About emotions. And it talks to the area below. At the top, the cortex. Only in primates. It processes visual information, sensory stuff, etc. Also, you get the abstract depressive stuff there, and makes the rest of the brain go along with it. What depression is about is the cortex whispering in the ear of the rest of the brain, saying, this is as real as you were just physically assaulted by something. And you turn on the exact same things as a physical pain. Cingulotomy. a part of the cortex called anterior cingulate. If you sever this pathway, people get less depressed. But people do this procedure only when every medication, therapy, electroshocks is tried, with no results. But at the same time, takes away the pleasure. Hormones and depression. Thyroid hormones. It maintains your metabolism. Low thyroid hormones equals depression. Hypothyroidism. A disease called Hashimoto's disease. Problems with secreting thyroid hormone. If you get normal thyroid hormones release, depressions goes away. About 20% of major depressions are undiagnosed hypothyroid syndromes instead. Women have a higher incidence of major depression. Approximately twice the rate. Also, women have higher incidence to depression after given birth, a postpartum depression. Also, around the time of their period, and around menopause. The notion that, if you don't ruminate about bad emotion you don't get them is nonsense. It is all about hormones. In women, the effects of estrogen and progesterone, and the ratio of estrogen-progesterone after giving birth, your period, etc. are going crazy. Which can change the number of receptors for the neurotransmitters, which can produce depression. Glucocorticoids. Released through the adrenal gland during stress. In humans is called hydrocortisone, or cortisol. High levels of cortisol equals major depression. If you have the first depressive episodes due to some stressful event, you come out the other side. The second time, you're okay. But around the 4 to 5 time of stress-induced depression, things start cycling, and you no longer need a major stressor to cause you a high depressive state. Cushing's disease. If you secrete a lot of glucocorticoids equals depression. All because glucocorticoids depleted dopamine in your brain. But all this knowledge is only effective for treating for 30 to 40% of depressives. So now you need psychology of depression. Freud. People who have depression and come out the other side are called mourning. People who fall in major depression are called melancholia. Freud said, if you lose a loved one, or even a loved concept, or loved goal, most people are able to focus on the love and the sense of loss, you mourn, and you come out the other end. But some people, in melancholia, people can't put the negative feeling in the background, and instead you're awash in love, hate, regret, pain, etc. And he said depression is aggression turned inward. But you can't do modern science based on these thoughts. Experimental psychology. Psychology of stress. Which says that the same external misery. You feel more stressed. You turn on a stress response. You're more at risk for stress-related disease. And if you don't have outlets for the frustration caused by the stressor, if you feel like you have no control, if you have no predictability as when it's occurring, you don't have anybody's shoulder to cry on. Where depression has pathological extremes of these. Depression, it's learned helplessness. If something awful happens, they decide that it's the entire world. Lose a parent to death when you're under 10 years of age. And for the rest of your life, you're more at risk for a major depression. Biology plus psychology in depression. The critical link is stress. Depression is a genetic disorder, it has some heritability. If an identical twin is depressed, the other has a 50% chance of having it. Full siblings 25%. Half siblings 8%. But genes and depression are not about inevitability, they're about vulnerability. It's a gene related to serotonin. Some researchers looked at 17,000 kids growing up in New Zealand, following them year after year, and looking at their genetic makeup. And seeing at their 20s years old, who got problems with major depression. They wondered if somebody with the bad gene had more risk for depression. But it doesn't make a difference. Unless you have a history of exposure to major stressors, including parental divorce, physical abuse, death of family member, etc. The kids who had the good version of the gene, as they have more history of major stressors, their risk of depression goes up. The ones with the bad version, as they have more history of stressors, they have a much higher risk of depression. A 30-fold difference in likelihood. Where glucocorticoids regulate the function of this gene. This is not, oh, pull yourself together, we all get depressed, this is as real of a biological disorder as is diabetes.